The morning had started like any other in Cedar Grove Estates. The late April sun cast long shadows across our front lawn as I sipped my coffee on the porch, watching the neighborhood slowly come to life. Being a paramedic in the same community where you live creates a special kind of connection. I knew the families, the shortcuts between streets, and exactly which intersections to avoid during school pickup hours. My pregnant wife, Ellie, waddled out to join me, her hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. "How is little Emily doing this morning?" I asked, placing my palm against the roundness of her stomach. I felt a solid kick in response and smiled. Just 6 more weeks until our daughter would arrive. Ellie lowered herself carefully into the chair beside me. "She is practicing her gymnastics routine again," Ellie replied. "I swear she never sleeps." She looked exhausted but radiant, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun. "Are you working the late shift again tonight?" I nodded. "Unfortunately, yes. But after that I have 3 days off. We can finally finish the nursery painting." Our conversation was interrupted by the familiar sound of clicking heels on concrete. Across the street, Karen Mitchell strode purposefully along the sidewalk, clipboard in hand. The infamous president of our homeowners association. Karen had moved to Cedar Grove 3 years ago, and within 6 months, she had campaigned her way to HOA presidency. Since then, life in our once relaxed community had transformed into a constant state of vigilance against violations, real or imagined. While most people respected first responders like myself and the firefighters 2 doors down, Karen viewed us all equally as potential rule breakers. "Good morning, Mitchell residents," she called out without warmth, her eyes scanning our property. "I notice your trash bins are still visible from the street. They should have been moved to the side yard by now." Ellie tensed beside me. I placed a calming hand on her arm. "Good morning, Karen. I will move them right away," I replied evenly. "I had an emergency call that ran late last night." Karen made a note on her clipboard. "The rules apply to everyone, regardless of occupation. That is why they are called rules." She continued her patrol, stopping at the Johnson house to photograph their newly installed basketball hoop. "I cannot wait until the board elections next year," Ellie muttered. "Someone needs to challenge her." I had witnessed Karen's reign of petty tyranny grow increasingly bold. Last month, she had issued violation notices to the Ramherses for allowing their children to create chalk art on their own driveway. The month before, she had measured the width of the Andersons' extended driveway and demanded they remove the extra concrete for being precisely 3 inches wider than regulation. But nothing compared to her obsession with property lines and easements. "Did you hear what she did to old Mrs. Kinsey?" Ellie asked, keeping her voice low. "Sent her a $1,000 fine because her rose bushes extended 8 inches beyond her property line. The poor woman is on a fixed income." I shook my head in disbelief. Someone needs to stand up to her. Little did I know that someone would soon be me. That evening the storm clouds rolled in as I prepared for my shift. Thunder rumbled in the distance as I kissed Ellie goodbye. "Do not wait up for me," I said, placing one more kiss on her forehead. "Get some rest. You and Emily both need it." 4 hours into my shift, the call came in. Cardiac arrest, 42 Maple Street, just a few blocks from my own home. My partner James and I raced through the rain-slicked streets, sirens howling. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. 62-year-old male, unresponsive, CPR in progress by family member. Every second counted. As we turned onto Maple Street, I immediately noticed the challenge. Cars lined both sides of the narrow road. There had been some kind of gathering at the house. The only space available would require us to pull partially across Karen's pristine corner lot. "We need to get close," James urged. "We cannot carry the equipment and stretcher from too far away in this downpour." I made the decision instantly. I pulled the ambulance as close as possible to the patient's home, which meant our back wheels rested slightly on the edge of Karen's immaculate lawn. There was no time to hesitate. A life hung in the balance. As we rushed inside with our equipment, I had no idea that those 23 minutes, the time it took us to stabilize the patient, load him into the ambulance, and depart for the hospital, would change everything. We saved him. Mr. Peterson's heart had stopped beating for nearly 4 minutes when we arrived, but through CPR, defibrillation, and medication, we managed to restore his rhythm. As we wheeled him toward the ambulance on the stretcher, the rain had subsided to a light drizzle. That was when I saw her, Karen, standing beside our vehicle, phone raised, taking photographs. She wore a yellow raincoat cinched tightly at the waist, her face a mask of righteous indignation. "This is unacceptable," she declared as we approached. "You have parked on HOA property. This area is not designated for emergency vehicles." I stared at her in disbelief. "Ma'am, we are in the middle of an emergency transport," I explained, my voice strained from the stress of the resuscitation. "We need to get this patient to the hospital immediately." Karen stepped directly into my path. "You will need to move your vehicle and find another place to park. You are trespassing on HOA grounds." James continued loading the patient while I attempted to reason with her. "Every second counts right now. This man nearly died. We will be gone in moments." "I want your name and badge number," she demanded. "The HOA will be filing a formal complaint with your department. You people cannot just ignore the rules because you have flashing lights." There was no time to argue. Mr. Peterson needed hospital care urgently. "Please step aside," I said firmly. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and carefully pulled away. In the rearview mirror, I could see Karen still photographing the ambulance, her expression triumphant. The next morning, after handing off my shift, I returned to the station to document the incident. What I discovered left me frozen in disbelief. The ambulance, the same one we had used to save Mr. Peterson's life, had been vandalized. Deep scratch marks ran along the driver's side, spelling out the word trespasser in jagged letters. Red spray paint covered part of the rear doors. Worst of all, one of the rear tires had been slashed. "What the hell happened?" my supervisor demanded, circling the vehicle in shock. "I think I know," I replied grimly. I explained the encounter with Karen and how we had briefly parked with wheels on HOA property during the emergency. "This is criminal damage to emergency equipment," my supervisor stated. "We are calling the police and checking surveillance footage." By noon, we had our answer. The station's security cameras had captured everything. At 3:17 a.m., a hooded figure had approached the ambulance in the parking bay. The image was grainy but unmistakable. Karen, with her distinctive gait and build, methodically vandalizing the vehicle that had saved a life just hours before. The evidence seemed irrefutable. Yet when I presented it to the HOA board that evening, I encountered a wall of resistance. "The footage is unclear," stated Roger Williams, the board treasurer. "It could be anyone of similar build." "The person is wearing a hooded jacket," added Diane Peterson, another board member. "We cannot make a positive identification from this." I was stunned. But who else would write "trespasser" on an ambulance? This happened right after the incident on Maple Street. The board members exchanged glances. "We understand your frustration," Roger replied smoothly. "But without clear evidence, there is nothing the HOA can do. Perhaps you should focus on ensuring your emergency vehicles respect private property boundaries in the future. As I left the meeting, a cold realization settled over me. The board was not just supporting Karen, they were afraid of her. She had accumulated too much power, too much control. The community I served as a paramedic, the neighborhood I called home, was under the thumb of a woman who would vandalize an emergency vehicle rather than allow its wheels to touch her precious grass during a life-or-death situation. Walking home, I passed Mr. Peterson's house. His wife was in the yard planting flowers. She waved when she saw me. "He is doing well," she called out. "The doctor said if you had arrived even 2 minutes later." She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. That night, as Ellie slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. Karen had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. This was no longer about petty rules or property lines. This was about public safety and abuse of power. Someone needed to stop her, and that someone would have to be me. The next morning, I began my counterattack. I purchased a small notebook dedicated to documenting every HOA violation that Karen herself committed but conveniently overlooked. I started with the obvious. Her garden shed exceeded the maximum height by nearly 2 feet. Her fence was 6 inches over the property line on the east side. The fancy water feature in her backyard had never received proper approval from the architectural committee. But I needed more than just notes. I needed allies. I began knocking on doors throughout Cedar Grove, starting with those I knew had experienced Karen's wrath firsthand. Mrs. Kinsey invited me in for tea, her arthritic hands shaking slightly as she showed me the fine notices she had received for her rose bushes. "I have lived here for 37 years, she told me, her voice quavering. "Those roses were planted by my late husband. I cannot afford to pay those fines on my Social Security, but I cannot bear to cut them back either." The Ramirez family shared documentation of the escalating fines they had received for their children's chalk drawings. She told us it was unsightly decoration of common visual areas, Mr. Ramirez explained, frustration evident in his voice. "Our children are afraid to play outside now." House by house, a pattern emerged. Karen was not just enforcing rules. She was selectively targeting certain residents while ignoring violations by her friends and allies on the board. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Tom Gardner, who worked in the county clerk's office, approached me one evening as I walked home from visiting neighbors. "I heard you are looking into the HOA finances," he said quietly. "You should request these specific documents." He handed me a folded piece of paper with dates and file numbers. The next day, I submitted a formal request to examine the HOA financial records, focusing on the documents Tom had identified. What I discovered was infuriating. Over the past 18 months, HOA funds, our mandatory dues, had been systematically misappropriated. Nearly $7,000 had been spent on landscape improvements to community visual corridors, but the invoices all led back to Karen's personal property. She had used our money to install exotic plants, decorative stonework, and custom lighting around her own home, classifying it as community enhancement because her corner lot was highly visible. Armed with evidence, I contacted Lisa Chen, a reporter for the local newspaper who had previously written articles about HOA overreach in other communities. She listened intently as I laid out the evidence of financial misconduct, selective enforcement, and the ambulance vandalism. "This is serious," Lisa acknowledged. "If you are willing to go on record, I can start investigating officially." I agreed, knowing the risks but feeling I had no choice. 3 days later, Lisa's preliminary inquiries stirred the hornet's nest. A courier delivered a formal cease and desist letter to our home, threatening legal action for defamation and spreading false information intended to damage the reputation of the HOA leadership. Ellie found me at the kitchen table that evening, staring at the letter. Her pregnancy had advanced to the point where movement was difficult, yet her face showed nothing but determination as she sat beside me. "Robert," she said, taking my hand in hers, "you cannot back down now. That woman vandalized an emergency vehicle, your vehicle, the same one you used to save lives. What happens next time there is an emergency? Will first responders hesitate because they are afraid of property line violations?" She was right. This had moved beyond neighborhood politics. It was about the safety of our community. "Our daughter will be born soon," Ellie continued. "What kind of neighborhood do we want her to grow up in? One where children cannot draw with chalk, where an elderly woman cries over rose bushes, where ambulances are vandalized for saving lives." I squeezed her hand. "No, that is not the world we want for Emily." The next morning, I emailed all the evidence I had gathered to Lisa Chen. By afternoon, she confirmed the newspaper would run a full investigation. The battle lines were drawn. Karen might have power and influence, but I had truth on my side, and increasingly I had the community behind me. What I did not yet realize was how ugly things would get before they got better. The response was swift and merciless. 3 days after my meeting with Lisa Chen, I received an official notice from the HOA. I was being fined $500 for creating excessive noise disturbances with my vehicle. The notice specifically cited the ambulance sirens as a violation of community noise ordinances. "This is ridiculous," Ellie exclaimed, reading the notice over my shoulder. "They cannot fine you for responding to emergencies. That is literally your job." The next day brought another violation, $350 for improper parking of commercial vehicles in a residential zone. The day after that, $250 for unauthorized modifications to property, regarding the security cameras we had installed after receiving the cease and desist letter. But Karen was not content with financial harassment. At the emergency HOA meeting she convened, she proposed suspending my membership privileges, effectively barring me from using community amenities or attending future meetings. The vote passed 4-2, with only the Andersons and Ramirez's voting against it. The pressure extended beyond HOA boundaries. Someone, and I had little doubt who, had filed a complaint with the city inspector regarding unauthorized commercial activity in a residential zone, citing my occasional practice of driving the ambulance home between shifts with department permission. The inspector who showed up was apologetic but firm. "Someone submitted extensive documentation," he explained. "I have to follow up on all complaints." At work, my supervisor called me into his office. "Robert, we have received several complaints about your conduct," he began, looking uncomfortable. "Allegations of property damage, noise violations, unauthorized use of emergency equipment. I know this is not like you, but I have to place you on administrative review until this is cleared up." My stomach dropped. Karen was not just attacking my home life. She was threatening my career, my ability to provide for my growing family. Ellie was now just weeks from her due date, her doctor concerned about her rising blood pressure from the stress. That night, I sat alone on our front porch, watching the sunset and wondering if the fight was worth it. Maybe we should just sell the house, move somewhere else, start over. Ellie deserved peace in these final weeks of pregnancy. Emily deserved to be born into a home without this cloud hanging over it. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. I looked up to see Dan Forrester, the retired fire chief who lived 3 doors down. He was carrying a folder under his arm. "Evening, Robert," he said, settling uninvited into the chair beside me. "Heard you are having some trouble with our illustrious HOA president." I nodded wearily. "That is an understatement." Dan placed the folder on the table between us. "I have been watching that woman for 2 years," he said, "documenting everything. Was going to make my move next election, but seems like you beat me to it." I opened the folder to find methodically organized evidence: photos, dates, times, incidents. Dan had been building a case against Karen's mismanagement and abuse of power since shortly after she took office. "Why are you showing me this now?" I asked. "Because you stood up first," he replied simply, "and because I saw what she did to your ambulance. I was coming home late that night, saw her in the parking bay, thought about intervening but decided to photograph it instead." He pulled out his phone and showed me clear, unmistakable images of Karen in the act of vandalism, far better quality than the grainy security footage. "You have had this evidence all along?" I asked, stunned. Dan nodded. "Was waiting for the right moment. That moment is now, and I am not the only one ready to stand with you." As if on cue, a car pulled into my driveway. Mrs. Kinsey emerged, supported by her grandson. Behind them came the Ramirez family, the Andersons, and half a dozen other neighbors I had spoken with over the past week. "We heard about the fines," Mrs. Kinsey said, her voice stronger than I remembered. "We heard about your job. This is not right." Mr. Anderson stepped forward. "My brother is on the city council. He wants to meet with you tomorrow." Mrs. Ramirez added, "And my cousin works at the newspaper with Lisa Chen. She says the story is ready to run this weekend." Standing there in my front yard, surrounded by neighbors who had found their courage, I felt something shift inside me. Karen had pushed too far. She had tried to isolate me, to break me down with financial and professional pressure. Instead, she had awakened a community. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "All of you." Dan clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Karen thinks she has all the power. Time to show her what real power looks like, people standing together." That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept soundly. The fight was not over, but I was no longer fighting alone. The next morning, I submitted a formal complaint to the State Housing Authority regarding the Cedar Grove HOA's financial mismanagement and harassment practices. With Dan's evidence added to my own, the documentation package ran to nearly 60 pages. I followed it with complaints to the City Council and the county prosecutor regarding the criminal vandalism of emergency equipment. Lisa Chen's article hit the Sunday edition with the headline, "HOA President Vandalizes Ambulance During Emergency Response." The front page story featured Dan's photographs, clear and damning. The article detailed Karen's escalating pattern of rule enforcement, the financial misappropriation, and her retaliation against a paramedic who dared to challenge her authority. By Monday morning, the story had been picked up by local television news. Reporters gathered at the entrance to Cedar Grove Estates, seeking comments from residents. One by one, people stepped forward, the Andersons describing how Karen had forced them to tear out a memorial garden planted for their deceased daughter because it used non-approved plants. The Ramirezes showing the violation notices for their children's chalk drawings. Mrs. Kinsey, tearfully explaining how her late husband's roses had become the target of Karen's obsession with property lines. The City Council announced an immediate investigation into the HOA's financial practices. The police department publicly confirmed they were investigating the ambulance vandalism. The State Housing Authority sent representatives to review HOA records and interview board members. Karen's response was predictable. She attempted to circle the wagons. HOA emails mysteriously disappeared from the server. Financial records were suddenly misplaced. Board members were instructed not to speak to investigators or media. But it was too late. The story had broken open, and with it, people's willingness to remain silent. Roger Williams, the HOA treasurer, was the first to crack. Faced with potential charges of financial misconduct, he provided investigators with complete records of every dubious expenditure Karen had authorized. "I never felt I had a choice," he admitted in his statement. "She controlled everything. If you opposed her, you became a target." Karen grew increasingly desperate. A formal legal notice arrived at our door, threatening a $1 million defamation lawsuit against me personally. But when Lisa Chen published that letter in her follow-up article, public opinion exploded. The county prosecutor's office was flooded with calls demanding action on the ambulance vandalism case. My suspension from work was lifted after my supervisor received hundreds of supportive emails and calls from community members. "Never seen anything like it," he told me as I returned to duty. "People really stood up for you." Even as the investigation gathered momentum, Karen made her most serious mistake. She attempted to contact witnesses, including Dan Forrester, with thinly veiled threats about consequences if they continued to speak against her. Dan immediately reported this to the authorities, adding witness intimidation to the growing list of charges. The neighborhood transformed before my eyes. People who had once hurried indoors when Karen approached now gathered openly on their lawns, discussing the latest developments. Children resumed playing freely, chalk drawings reappearing on driveways. Mrs. Kinsey's grandson brought over additional rose bushes, planting them defiantly along her property line. Each day brought new revelations. Karen had used HOA funds to pay for personal vacations disguised as educational conferences. She had accepted kickbacks from preferred contractors. She had maintained secret files on residents who opposed her, documenting their every minor infraction while ignoring violations by her supporters. As Ellie's due date approached, the pressure on Karen intensified. The HOA board, seeing which way the wind was blowing, voted to distance themselves from her actions. 3 members resigned, claiming they had been misled about the extent of the financial improprieties. Karen made one final, desperate attempt to regain control. She called an emergency HOA meeting, limited to members in good standing, conveniently excluding those she had suspended, including me. But word leaked out. The meeting was to be held at the community clubhouse on Thursday evening, where she planned to rally her remaining supporters and vote on a resolution condemning the defamatory allegations against her leadership. She did not anticipate what awaited her there. The community clubhouse had never been so full. Residents packed the room, standing against walls and crowding doorways. At the front table sat not just the remaining HOA board members, but also representatives from the State Housing Authority, the City Council, and the County Prosecutor's Office. News cameras positioned themselves in the back corners. Karen entered precisely at 7 o'clock, her usual clipboard clutched tightly against her chest. She faltered momentarily at the sight of the crowd, then straightened her shoulders and marched to the podium. "This meeting will come to order," she announced, her voice carrying the practiced authority that had intimidated so many for so long. "Only members in good standing may participate. I must ask those who have been suspended or are under violation notice to leave immediately." No one moved. From the back of the room, a city official stood. Actually, Ms. Mitchell, this is now an official public hearing regarding the Cedar Grove Homeowners Association. Everyone present has the right to attend. Karen's face flushed. I was not informed of any change in status. This is an HOA meeting that I called according to bylaws. The bylaws you have repeatedly violated. The question came from Councilman Anderson, Mr. Anderson's brother from the city council. He approached the front of the room carrying a thick binder. We have completed our preliminary review of Cedar Grove HOA finances and practices. The findings are deeply troubling. For the next 30 minutes, the councilman methodically outlined the investigation's discoveries. Financial misappropriation totaling over $43,000 over 3 years. Selective enforcement of rules. Falsification of meeting minutes. Unauthorized fines. The list went on, each item meticulously documented with dates, amounts, and evidence. "This is absurd," Karen interrupted, her voice rising. "These accusations are part of a vendetta against me by certain disgruntled residents who refuse to comply with community standards." The councilman looked up from his notes. Would that include vandalizing an emergency vehicle during an active medical response? The prosecutor stepped forward then, placing photographs on the table, Dan's clear images of Karen spray painting and scratching the ambulance. "Ms. Mitchell, we have confirmed these images as authentic. They show you committing criminal damage to emergency equipment, a felony in this state." Karen's facade began to crack. "That ambulance was trespassing on private property. I have rights." From the back of the room, I finally spoke. "That ambulance was responding to a cardiac arrest. The patient survived because we reached him in time. Would you prefer we had let him die rather than put 2 wheels on your grass?" The room fell silent. Karen looked around wildly, suddenly realizing she stood alone. "You do not understand what it takes to maintain standards in a community like this," she said, her voice shaking. "Without strict enforcement, property values decline. Without me, this neighborhood would fall into chaos." Mrs. Kinsey rose slowly from her seat, leaning on her cane. "I have lived here 40 years, young woman, long before you arrived. We were never in chaos. We were a community. You took that from us." The city official cleared his throat. "Based on our findings, this board is hereby suspended pending completion of our investigation. The State Housing Authority will appoint an interim management committee consisting of residents with no prior board involvement." "You cannot do that," Karen shouted. "I was elected." "And you will be removed," the official replied calmly. "The evidence of misconduct is overwhelming." "Furthermore," added the prosecutor, "you are being charged with criminal damage to emergency equipment, misappropriation of funds, and witness intimidation. Officers are waiting outside to take your statement." For a moment I thought Karen might physically lash out. Her body tensed, her knuckles white around her clipboard. Then something seemed to break inside her. "You ungrateful people," she hissed. "Everything I did was for the good of this community, for property values, for standards. You will regret this." No one responded. No one needed to. As 2 police officers entered the room, Karen gathered her belongings with shaking hands. "This neighborhood will fall apart without me," she declared to no one in particular. "Just wait and see." As she was escorted out, a spontaneous cheer erupted in the room. People embraced, some crying with relief. The mood shifted from tension to celebration as neighbors who had been intimidated into silence for years finally reconnected. The meeting continued, with the city official outlining the process for reorganizing the HOA. "New bylaws will be drafted with resident input," he explained. Checks and balances will be implemented to prevent any future abuse of power. Financial controls will be established. Standing at the back of the room, I felt a hand on my shoulder. Dan Forrester nodded toward the door Karen had exited through. "Worth it?" he asked. I thought about the weeks of stress, the financial pressure, the threat to my job. Then I looked around at the liberated faces of my neighbors, at the children no longer afraid to play outdoors, at Mrs. Kinsey dabbing tears of joy from her eyes. "Every bit of it," I replied. 3 weeks later, a moving truck pulled up to Karen's house. The process was quick and silent. No neighbors came to say goodbye. No farewell party was thrown. By sunset, the house stood empty, a "for sale" sign already planted in the front yard. The criminal case against Karen had been resolved through a plea agreement, community service, restitution for the damaged ambulance, and a ban from serving on any HOA board for 10 years. The civil suits for financial mismanagement would take longer to settle, but the immediate threat she posed was gone. That same evening, as the last rays of sunlight painted Cedar Grove in warm hues, Ellie went into labor. The contractions started gently at first, then intensified rapidly. This time, when the ambulance arrived, driven by my colleagues James and Sarah, there was no question of where to park. Neighbors came out to help clear a path, offering encouragement as Ellie was carefully loaded inside. Emily Rose was born just after midnight, 7 pounds, 3 ounces of perfection. Her cry was strong, her grip on my finger determined. Holding her in those first precious moments, I marveled at how much had changed in our community during the months leading to her birth. She would grow up in a neighborhood where people looked out for each other again, where rules existed to serve residents rather than control them. During our first week home with Emily, visitors arrived steadily bearing gifts and support. Mrs. Kinsey brought a hand-knitted blanket. "My mother made one for each of my children," she explained, her eyes bright with memory. "I wanted your little one to have the same." The Ramirez children had created colorful chalk drawings on their driveway spelling out, "Welcome baby Emily," surrounded by hearts and flowers. The Andersons organized a meal train, ensuring we had home-cooked dinners delivered every evening for 2 weeks. Most surprisingly, Roger Williams, the former HOA treasurer, stopped by with his wife. "I wanted to apologize," he said, awkwardly holding a stuffed teddy bear. "I should have spoken up sooner about what was happening. I was a coward." "You spoke up when it counted," I assured him. "That is what matters." The interim HOA committee, led by Dan Forrester, worked diligently to rebuild the organization from scratch. The new bylaws were ratified in a community-wide vote, emphasizing transparency, term limits, and resident input. Financial records were now published monthly. Major decisions required general membership approval. No single person could issue fines or violations without review by multiple board members. One sunny Saturday morning, when Emily was 3 weeks old, I received a special surprise. Neighbors gathered in the station parking lot where the ambulance had been vandalized. What began as a handful of volunteers swelled to dozens as the day progressed. Together, they cleaned, repaired, and repainted the vehicle that had been damaged during Karen's attack. Children added their handprints to the back doors, creating a colorful border. Above them, Mrs. Kinsey's grandson, a professional sign painter, carefully lettered a simple message: "This community stands behind its heroes." When I arrived for my first shift back from paternity leave, I was speechless at the transformation. The once defaced ambulance now stood as a symbol of community strength and resilience. "We figured it needed a proper Cedar Grove touch," Dan explained with a wink. As the weeks passed and summer approached, the neighborhood bloomed. not just with flowers but with renewed community spirit. Block parties sprang up spontaneously. Children played freely between yards. The invisible barriers Karen had created dissolved in the sunshine of newfound freedom. On a perfect June evening, I decided to take Emily for her first neighborhood walk. Ellie was finally getting some much-needed rest, and I wanted daughter time. Strapping Emily to my chest in her carrier, I set out along the familiar streets. Our path took us past the home of Mr. Peterson, the cardiac patient whose emergency had sparked the whole conflict. He was out watering his garden, looking remarkably healthy for a man who had technically died and been brought back just months before. "Is that your little one?" he called out, turning down his hose. "This is Emily," I replied, stopping so he could see her. 3 weeks old today." He smiled broadly. "Beautiful, just beautiful." He hesitated, then added, "I never properly thanked you for that night. The doctors said if you had been even 2 minutes later." He trailed off. "Just doing my job," I assured him. "No," he said firmly. "It was more than that. You stood up to that woman when no one else would. You risked everything to do what was right. This whole neighborhood is different because of that." As I continued our walk, Emily sleeping peacefully against my chest, I reflected on his words. The battle with Karen had never really been about property lines or HOA rules or even an ambulance. It had been about what kind of community we wanted to live in, one ruled by fear and petty tyranny, or one defined by mutual respect and support. We reached the corner where Karen's house now stood empty. The roses she had once fined Mrs. Kinsey for were in full bloom across the street, their scent filling the evening air. From nearby yards came the sound of children laughing, of neighbors chatting, of life unfolding without fear of clipboard-wielding critics. I looked down at my sleeping daughter. "Welcome home, Emily," I whispered. "The neighborhood is ready for you now."